Ever have one of those like brilliant ideas at work?
Yeah.
Something you just know I/O would make things better, but you just can't seem to get anyone on board.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, you're not alone. So today we're going to go deep on the hidden forces that make it so hard to get new ideas adopted, even when they're objectively good. Our guide for this deep dive is the book, The Human Element, Overcoming the Resistance That Awaits New Ideas.
Oh, good one.
And by the end, you'll have a whole new framework for thinking about innovation and maybe even a strategy or two for getting your own great ideas to stick.
I like it.
So the book starts with this idea of fuel.
Yeah.
Basically, the positive aspects of an idea that draw people in. Think things like convenience, saving money, boosting social status. You get a picture.
Yeah.
Seems straightforward, right?
There.
But the authors argue there's a flip side we often miss.
Yeah. That flip side is what they call friction. Those psychological forces that act as resistance to change, even when logic says we should embrace it.
It's like
trying to roll a boulder uphill.
Yeah.
You might be pushing hard, but there's this unseen force working against you.
That analogy really clicked for me. I mean, we've all felt that resistance, right?
Oh, yeah.
You see a better way to do things, but something holds everyone back. I'm actually facing that right now with a new project at work.
Well, that's precisely why the book resonates with so many people. It provides a language for these invisible forces, which is the first step to tackling them. The authors break down friction into 4 main types, each with its own unique flavor of resistance.
Okay, let's dive into those 4 frictions. First up, inertia. I'm picturing a giant sleepy sloth. Am I on the right track?
Actually, closer to a stubborn shore crab. The book uses this example of how these crabs will only eat mussels of a specific size, even if it means going hungry when plenty of other perfectly good mussels are around.
Yeah, they literally starve themselves rather than try a slightly bigger mussel. That seems counterproductive.
It seems irrational to us, but it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. For the crab, sticking with what's familiar minimizes risk. Trying a new mussel size could mean wasted effort or even injury, so there's a deep-seated preference for what's known even at a cost.
Okay, so it's not just laziness. It's wired into our brains to prefer the familiar.
Yeah.
And that explains so much, like why that Tropicana redesign flopped so hard. People freaked out over a new carton design, even though the juice was the same.
Exactly. We see it time and again from software updates. People resist to that coworker who refuses to learn the new email system. We overestimate how much logic drives our choices. Familiarity is a powerful force.
So how do we fight this inertia?
Yeah.
I'm guessing we can't just logic our way out of it.
Force rarely works. Instead, the book suggests starting small, introducing changes incrementally so they feel less jarring. Think of it like exposure therapy, gradually increasing exposure to something someone fears.
Oh, like starting with a picture of a spider before making someone hold a tarantula.
Exactly. Make the unfamiliar feel familiar. Another tactic is using analogies like how Steve Jobs used the concept of a desktop to explain computer files when personal computers were brand new.
I love a good analogy. It's like sneaking in healthy veggies by blending them into a smoothie.
And speaking of sneaking things in the book, have this really clever add-in extreme strategy.
Ah, yes, the example of the wine list. You add a ridiculously expensive bottle, not to sell it, but to make the $40 bottles seem like bargains. Suddenly that price point feels more reasonable by comparison.
So if I wanted to get my team to adopt a new project management system, maybe I present a super complex, high-cost alternative first, making my preferred option seem much easier to swallow.
Precisely. It's a way to reframe people's perception of what's normal. But inertia is just one piece of the puzzle. Sometimes even when the benefits are clear, change feels just too costly. That's where the second friction comes in. Effort.
Okay, effort. I can relate to that one.
Mm-hmm.
If a task feels like too much work, I'll probably procrastinate even if I know I shouldn't. Is that what we're talking about here? It's definitely a part of it. The book points out how we're constantly making these cost-benefit analyses, and often convenience trumps quality. Think about why people still listen to compressed music files even though the sound quality is demonstrably worse.
Right. It's just so easy to stream millions of songs on my phone. I'm definitely guilty of choosing convenience over audio fidelity.
It's the path of least resistance, and we're all wired for it. This even plays out in hiring decisions. Managers say they want the most competent candidate, but often choose someone who seems easier to manage, even if they're slightly less skilled.
Because dealing with a difficult personality takes effort, and sometimes we just don't have the bandwidth. So how do we overcome this effort friction? Do we just have to, willpower our way through it?
Willpower is a finite resource, and it's rarely the answer. The book dives into some much more effective strategies. One is creating a clear roadmap, breaking down a complex task into smaller, more manageable steps.
Like in that war bonds example where simply telling people when and how to donate made a huge difference in participation rates.
Exactly. It removes the guesswork and makes it feel less daunting. Another tactic is what they call if-then triggers. For example, a real estate agent tells his friend to ask every new colleague, "Do you need an agent?" right when they meet. It links a simple trigger to a desired action.
Okay, that's a clever way to make it more automatic. But what about situations where the task itself just requires a lot of effort, like moving heavy furniture? Can we hack our way out of that kind of exertion?
Sometimes the solution is to literally remove the physical barrier. The book gives the example of Beach House, a furniture company that was struggling to sell sofas because people dreaded getting rid of their old ones.
Oh, I can relate.
Yeah.
Moving a sofa is a logistical nightmare.
So Beach House started offering to remove and donate the old sofa for free when you bought a new one. Sales skyrocketed because they removed a major pain point.
That's so smart. It's like those desire paths you see in parks, where people cut across the grass instead of taking the paved walkway. They're literally carving out a path of least resistance.
Exactly. And that's a valuable lesson for anyone trying to promote a new behavior. Pay attention to those desire paths. Where are people finding shortcuts? Those are clues to where you can reduce effort and make the desired action the easier choice.
This is making me rethink some of my own processes, for sure. But there's a whole other layer to this, right? What about the emotional side of resistance? I feel like that can be even harder to overcome.
It absolutely can be. That's where we get to the third friction, emotion. It's all about those negative feelings that change can trigger fear, anxiety, distrust, even feeling overwhelmed. And those emotions can be surprisingly powerful, even when we know logically that change is a good thing. The book has this fascinating example of why cake mixes were initially a flop in the 1950s.
Cake mix?
Yeah.
Really? Who doesn't love cake? Seems like the easiest thing in the world.
Well, back then it wasn't just about the cake, it was about the emotional experience of baking. Women felt like using a mix was cheating, robbing them of the pride and satisfaction of baking from scratch.
So it wasn't about convenience or taste. It was about feeling like a real baker. That's wild.
It perfectly illustrates how emotional needs can be as important as functional ones, maybe even more so. And we see this play out in all sorts of innovations. The book also talks about how Tinder disrupted online dating by removing the emotional friction of rejection.
Yeah, I can see that traditional dating sites felt like putting yourself out there for constant judgment. Tinder made it feel more like a game where mutual interest was baked into the design.
Exactly. They removed the fear of putting yourself out there and getting shot down, which unlocked a whole new market of people who were hesitant to try online dating before.
Okay, so emotions are clearly a big deal. But how do we even start to identify those hidden emotional barriers when we're trying to get a new idea adopted?
The book stresses the importance of digging deeper than surface-level feedback. Don't just ask, what concerns do you have? Ask why. Uncover the real motivations behind the resistance.
It's like being an emotional detective. Do you have a good example of this in action?
There's this story of an entrepreneur pitching a software platform. The customer kept saying it was too expensive, but when they probed further, they realized it wasn't about the price itself.
Okay, so what was the real issue?
It was the customer's fear of not being able to get their board to approve the purchase. They were worried about the hassle and potential pushback, not the actual cost.
So it was more about navigating internal politics than the budget itself. So how did the entrepreneur address that?
Once they understood the real why, they provided testimonials and case studies from other companies to make the customer feel more confident about presenting the idea to their board.
So it's not just about listening, it's about understanding the underlying emotions driving people's reactions. I'm starting to see how tricky this can be.
It definitely requires a shift in thinking. The book also suggests becoming an ethnographer of sorts, observing people in their natural environment to uncover those hidden needs and pain points.
I love that. It's like Jane Goodall, but for innovators. Any good examples of this in action?
American Express had this great aha moment when they were trying to figure out why they weren't appealing to millennials. They sent researchers to shadow millennials and observe their spending habits.
And what do they find? Millennials are notoriously avocado toast obsessed, right?
Actually, they discovered that many millennials were afraid of credit cards. They'd grown up hearing horror stories about debt and associated credit cards with anxiety and financial instability.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
So even though Amex had amazing rewards programs, millennials weren't biting because the emotional baggage outweighed the benefits.
Exactly. It was pure emotional friction. Amex responded by creating a feature called Pay It Planet, which let people break down payments into smaller, more manageable chunks. It gave them a sense of control, and it was a huge hit.
Wow. So they actually redesigned their product based on emotional needs, not just functionality. That's a powerful example.
It really highlights how understanding your target audience's emotional context is critical. In fact, the book suggests that when building teams, we should prioritize hiring people who deeply understand those emotional nuances.
That makes sense, but I'm also wondering, are there times when we can design experiences to minimize those negative feelings?
Absolutely. The book gives the example of Livongo, a company that helps people manage chronic diseases like diabetes. They realized many people with these conditions felt judged and blamed for their illness.
Oh yeah, I can see that. It's like, you should be eating better. You should be exercising more. It just makes people feel worse.
Exactly. It created shame and guilt, making people less likely to engage in self-care.
So Livongo did something really clever. They hired people who actually had chronic diseases themselves to be coaches.
That's brilliant. They were able to connect on a deeper level, providing support that was empathetic and non-judgmental.
It made a world of difference because those coaches truly understood the emotional challenges their clients were facing. Yeah. It was a win-win for everyone involved.
Okay, so we've tackled inertia, effort, and emotion. I'm ready to face the final boss, reactance. I have a feeling this one's a real doozy. It can be, especially in our current climate. Reactance is that knee-jerk impulse to push back against anything that feels like a threat to our freedom or autonomy. Think of it like a rebellious teenager who does the opposite of what their parents tell them just to prove a point.
Oh, I definitely know a few teenagers like that.
Yeah.
But I can see how we all experience reactance to some degree. Like when someone's being pushy about an idea and you immediately dig in your heels, even if the idea itself isn't bad.
Exactly. And the book gives this wild example of the backlash against seatbelt laws back in the 80s. People felt like the government was trying to control them, so they resisted, even though seatbelts demonstrably save lives.
It seems so irrational now, but I guess it makes sense in the context of reactance. We don't like feeling manipulated or forced into doing something, even if it's good for us.
And that's the challenge with introducing new ideas. The more we push, the more resistance we might encounter.
Yeah.
So what's the solution? Well, the book suggests this intriguing concept of self-persuasion.
Self-persuasion. Okay, I'm listening. How do you get someone to convince themselves of something? Sounds like Jedi mind tricks.
Less about mind tricks, more about subtly guiding the thought process. There was this study where smokers who read an anti-smoking message out loud were more likely to quit than those who just listened to someone else read it.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
Because by reading it aloud, it became their own message, their own idea. They weren't being lectured, they were persuading themselves.
That's fascinating. So it's about getting people to arrive at the conclusion on their own rather than feeling like it's being imposed on them.
Exactly. And the book shares this great story of a legendary high school football coach, Bob Ledesser, who led his team to an insane winning streak. His secret: he didn't give rousing speeches or yell at his players.
Wait, so what did he do? Give them pep talks about inner strength?
Even simpler. He gave each player note cards and asked them to write down their personal goals for the week.
That's so clever. It shifted the focus from external motivation to internal motivation. It wasn't about pleasing the coach, it was about achieving their own goals.
And that made them more committed and more likely to succeed. It's self-persuasion in action.
Okay, so how do we actually put self-persuasion into practice? It feels a bit abstract.
The book emphasizes the power of asking questions rather than giving directives. Guide people on a journey of self-discovery instead of dictating the destination.
Instead of saying, you need to do this, it's more like, what if we tried this?
Exactly. They give this example of deep canvassing, a technique used by political activists. Instead of arguing or trying to change minds, they have in-depth conversations with voters asking open-ended questions about their beliefs.
I've heard of that. It's about helping people connect their values to the issue rather than imposing an outside viewpoint.
And it's been incredibly effective at shifting attitudes on complex issues. It's a way of encouraging self-reflection and leading people to their own conclusions.
Okay, so asking questions is a key tactic. What else can we do to overcome this pesky reactance?
Involving people in the design process is another powerful approach. When people feel like they have a hand in shaping an idea, they're much more likely to buy into it.
It's like the IKEA effect. We value things more when we've put effort into creating them.
Exactly. And the same applies to ideas. The book tells the story of Matter, a healthcare technology incubator in Chicago. They had to bring together a diverse group of stakeholders, hospitals, insurance companies, tech startups, all with potentially conflicting interests.
That sounds like a recipe for reactance overload.
It could have been, but they used co-design to bring everyone together. They held workshops, conducted interviews, facilitated discussions, and by involving everyone in the design process, they created a space where everyone felt ownership.
It's like turning potential adversaries into collaborators by giving them a voice.
Exactly. It minimizes reactance and builds consensus. Another strategy the book mentions is starting with small requests to build commitment.
Oh, like the classic foot-in-the-door technique. You ask for something small, and once someone agrees, they're more likely to say yes to bigger requests later on.
Precisely. And the book gives this rather unsettling but fascinating example of how brainwashing works.
Brainwashing? That sounds intense.
During the Korean War, Chinese captors would start by asking American POWs simple, agreeable questions like, would you agree that no country is perfect?
Okay, that's harmless enough. I can see where this is going.
It's a question almost everyone would say yes to. But then they'd gradually escalate the requests, eventually getting some POWs to denounce their own country.
That's both chilling and incredibly clever. It highlights how powerful this incremental approach can be, even for something as extreme as brainwashing.
It's a stark reminder that these techniques can be used for good or bad, so it's crucial to use them ethically.
Absolutely. But in the right context, it seems like this foot-in-the-door approach can be a really effective way to build buy-in.
Especially when combined with the other reactance-busting techniques we've discussed.
Okay, so we've explored the 4 frictions: inertia, effort, emotion, and reactance, and we've uncovered a whole toolbox of strategies for overcoming each one. I'm feeling like I have a superpower now.
Well, remember, with great power comes great responsibility. These insights can be used to manipulate, so it's crucial to use them ethically.
For sure. But when used for good, these ideas have the potential to unlock incredible innovation and positive change.
Exactly. And the beauty of this framework is that it applies to so many areas of life, not just business or product development. Think about how you can use these ideas to improve your relationships, communicate more effectively, or even just understand your own resistance to change.
That's a great point. It's like a new lens for viewing the world. But before we apply all this to our own lives, I want to hear about some real-world case studies from the book. They showcased how these principles can be used in completely different contexts, and I'm dying to know how they played out.
I'm happy to share. Let's start with Dubai's efforts to transition from an oil-based economy to a thriving startup ecosystem.
It's a massive undertaking. What were some of the key frictions they faced?
They had a classic case of inertia. People were accustomed to working for the government or large corporations. Starting a business was seen as risky and unconventional.
So they had to change a deeply ingrained mindset.
Exactly. And there was also a ton of effort involved. The regulations were complex, costs were high, and the process was time-consuming. Plus, there was that fear of failure, the potential to disappoint family. Emotional friction in full force.
Plus, I imagine some reactance, too. People probably felt like the government was trying to force them into entrepreneurship.
You nailed it. So how did they tackle all of this? Well, they took a multi-pronged approach targeting all 4 frictions.
Give me the highlights.
First, they launched massive public awareness campaigns showcasing successful Emirati entrepreneurs to combat that inertia. They even used analogies comparing starting a business to climbing a mountain, challenging but ultimately rewarding.
Love it. Make it aspirational, not intimidating.
Then, to tackle effort, they created free zones with simplified regulations and lower costs. They even provided roadmaps and mentorship to make the process less daunting.
Smart. It's like that create a roadmap strategy we talked about earlier, removing the ambiguity and making it feel more achievable.
Exactly. To address the emotional friction, they created a culture of celebration and support for entrepreneurs, launching awards programs and offering financial assistance to help people get started.
So they provided a safety net, mitigating that fear of failure.
And finally, to address reactance, they involved aspiring entrepreneurs in the design process, holding workshops and focus groups to get input on what would make Dubai a more attractive place to start a business.
So they gave people a voice, making them feel like they were part of the solution, not just being dictated to.
It was a brilliant strategy, and it worked. Dubai is now a global hub for entrepreneurship, and it's a testament to the power of understanding and addressing the human element.
That's an incredibly inspiring example of how a government can leverage these principles for large-scale change. What other case studies stood out to you?
The successful campaign to legalize recreational marijuana in the United States is another fascinating one. It involved changing deeply ingrained attitudes and beliefs about a substance that was once demonized.
Talk about an uphill battle. They were facing inertia, emotional friction, and reactance all at once.
Exactly. There was a lot of fear-mongering about increased crime and societal decay, and a strong sense of, the government shouldn't tell me what to do.
So how did they manage to shift public opinion on such a controversial issue?
They started by focusing on medical marijuana. It was a brilliant strategy, allowing them to address the inertia by familiarizing people with the idea of marijuana as a medicine.
It's like that start small tactic we talked about earlier. It makes it less radical, less threatening.
Exactly. It also helped reduce the emotional friction. People could see medical marijuana was helping those with serious illnesses, not leading to the predicted societal collapse.
Plus, they were able to build a coalition of support that included doctors, patients, and their families. That's powerful.
It was a much easier sell than recreational marijuana, but it paved the way for broader legalization efforts.
That's a perfect example of how even seemingly intractable issues can be tackled by understanding and addressing the four frictions.
It highlights the importance of patience and strategy. Sometimes change takes time, and it's about finding those incremental steps that make the ultimate goal feel more achievable.
Okay, that's a really encouraging example. What about the final case study, the one about fly homes, the real estate startup? I'm super curious about how they disrupted such a traditional industry.
This one's a great example of how a company used these principles to address a real-world problem that was causing a lot of pain for both buyers and sellers.
Because, let's be honest, the traditional real estate process is notoriously stressful and full of uncertainty. I've heard horror stories from friends who've gone through it.
And that's precisely what Fly Homes tapped into. They conducted in-depth ethnographic research, actually shadowing people throughout the entire home buying and selling process.
So they went beyond surveys and focus groups, actually observing people in the trenches.
Exactly. They wanted to see firsthand what people struggled with, the emotions they were experiencing, even the workarounds they were using. And they discovered that one of the biggest frictions was contingency.
Contingency. Refresh my memory on what that means.
It's when a buyer's offer to purchase a home is dependent on them selling their existing home first. So if the buyer's house doesn't sell, the deal falls through.
Oh, right. So it creates this cascade of uncertainty for both sides.
Yeah.
Buyers might lose their dream home if their own house doesn't sell, and sellers are left in limbo not knowing if the deal will actually go through.
It's a major source of stress and anxiety for everyone involved. And Fly Homes came up with a brilliant solution. They created a program called Trade Up that eliminated contingency altogether.
Okay, how do they manage that? Sounds like magic.
They essentially became both the buyer and the seller. They guaranteed to buy the customer's existing home at a predetermined price and then use their own cash to make an all-cash offer on the customer's new home.
So the customer didn't have to worry about selling their old house or getting financing approved. Fly Homes took care of everything.
Exactly. They removed a major point of friction, making the process much smoother and less stressful for everyone involved.
It's such a smart solution, and it shows how understanding the four frictions can lead to truly disruptive innovation.
It highlights that sometimes the best solutions come from addressing the emotional and psychological barriers, not just the logistical ones.
Okay, we've covered a ton of ground today. I feel like my brain is bursting with new insights about how to get ideas adopted, and I'm already thinking about how to apply these concepts in my own life. It's amazing how something so fundamental to the human experience can go unnoticed for so long.
It's like we've been playing this innovation game with a handicap, not realizing there's a secret set of rules.
And now we have the playbook. But the game's always changing, right?
Yeah.
What do you think the future holds for this whole friction thing?
That's a great question. And I think the future of friction is going to be shaped by several key trends.
I'm all ears. Hit me with your predictions.
Well, first, the world's moving faster than ever before. Technology is evolving at warp speed, and that creates a ton of friction.
It's like we're constantly playing catch-up, trying to adapt to new ways of working and living.
Exactly. Think about the rise of AI automation, the gig economy. All these trends disrupt traditional systems, creating both exciting possibilities and new challenges.
So we're going to see new types of friction emerge as we navigate these technological shifts.
Absolutely. And on top of that, there's the growing demand for personalization. People expect products, services, and experiences tailored to their unique needs.
We've all become accustomed to that. Amazon recommends level of personalization. Anything less feels clunky and frustrating.
Exactly. People are less tolerant of friction, especially when it comes to convenience and relevance. Companies that can nail that seamless, personalized experience will have a major edge.
It's like the difference between a smooth-running app and one that's constantly glitching. We're quick to abandon anything that feels too high effort.
And that trend is only going to accelerate. But here's another factor I think will play a huge role: the growing focus on mental health and well-being.
People are finally starting to prioritize their mental health, recognizing that stress and burnout are serious issues.
And that directly ties into friction. We're becoming more aware of the toll that unnecessary friction takes on our well-being.
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. All those little points of friction throughout the day add up.
Exactly. So I think we'll see a surge in demand for products and services that minimize stress and promote well-being.
Things like mindfulness apps, those noise-canceling headphones everyone's wearing, even those meal kit services that take the mental load out of cooking.
It's all about creating a less friction-filled existence, making it easier to prioritize those things that nourish us both mentally and physically.
Okay, so we've got accelerating change, personalization, and the rise of the well-being movement. What else is on your friction radar?
Well, this one's a bit more conceptual, but I think it's the most exciting trend. The growing recognition that friction, when used strategically, can be a force for good.
We've talked about how it can nudge people toward healthy choices, encourage thoughtful decision-making, even add value to certain experiences.
And I think we're just scratching the surface of that potential. Imagine governments using friction to incentivize eco-friendly behaviors or companies using it to foster deeper employee engagement.
It's like we're shifting from seeing friction as the enemy to seeing it as a powerful tool for shaping behavior and creating the world we want to live in.
That's a great way to put it. It's about moving from a reactive mindset to a proactive one, using friction intentionally to achieve positive outcomes.
This is blowing my mind. I'm starting to see friction everywhere now, and it's both fascinating and a little bit daunting.
The key is to not let it overwhelm you. Approach it with curiosity, experiment with different strategies, and always remember to use these insights ethically.
It's like we've been handed a new set of lenses for understanding the world.
And with these lenses, we can see possibilities that were hidden before.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our friction-filled deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
I feel like I've gained a superpower, and I'm excited to start putting these insights into practice.
Remember, friction is everywhere, and it's up to us to decide how we want to engage with it.
We can let it hold us back, or we can harness it to create positive change.
The choice is ours.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of friction.
Until next time.